Yo, welcome back everybody. My name is Nick. This is Swiftful Thinking, and this is a big video. This is one of the biggest videos that I've covered in a very long time, and I want to be very clear about it. So iOS 17 gave us so many new things in SwiftUI. It made it even more apparent that SwiftUI is the future of iOS, blah, 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 blah. You guys already know that. But in iOS 17, we got some major upgrades such as Swift data and macros, and I think the internet is loving both of those. I think those are both probably overrated, and we're going to realize that in a little bit. But the biggest thing in my mind to come out of iOS 17, and also the most underrated thing, is the new behaviors that we got, the new view modifiers that we got for scroll views. It sounds kind of dumb when you compare it to macros, but I promise you, this is much more important than Swift data. And I really want you guys to understand that the new modifiers for the scroll view enable us to add so many more user experiences to our app. So prior to this, working with the scroll view was all right, but there was a lot of behaviors such as paging that we didn't have in SwiftUI. And that was a major problem for a lot of apps, because if you ever built something like the TikTok app where you're swiping up, or you do Instagram Reels, that's a paging behavior. And all of that we now have unlocked in iOS 17 because of these new modifiers. And I think these are really underrated because these user interfaces are so common across so many applications. Like using Swift data is cool, maybe it's important to learn, but the vast majority of apps are probably never going to use Swift data. And if they do, it's not going to be for a very long time. Whereas the scroll view behavior is going to come into play so much faster because there's so many apps that need this sort of behavior to build the UI that they actually want. If you ever use the App Store app, there's paging behavior all over it. And so in this video, we're going to look at all of the new scroll view modifiers. I can't even mention them all right now. There's a bunch of new modifiers, but the highest level one that we're going to look at is just enabling paging behavior on the scroll view. So in this video, we're gonna look at how to use them, and then we're gonna look at some implementations. We're even gonna build a little mock TikTok feed, like a Reels feed where we can swipe up. And then we're gonna look at a bunch of other implementations as well. Again, I just wanna iterate that this is the biggest thing to come out of iOS 17 for SwiftUI. I know a lot of people are gonna disagree, but having been in this industry and building in SwiftUI for the last couple of years, I can tell you this is something that was missing from SwiftUI, and it is one of the biggest keys that is going to actually enable a lot of the big apps to now start to migrate to SwiftUI. Let's jump into Xcode, let's learn how to use these modifiers, and then let's build a couple sample implementations. Welcome back, everybody. This is, as I've already said, the most underrated thing to come out of iOS 17. This is the most important thing, in my mind, to come out of iOS 17. More important than Swift data, more important than macros, is the scroll view behavior for SwiftUI developers. This enables so many user experiences that we could not get previously in SwiftUI. Let's play around with the new scroll view behaviors in SwiftUI for iOS 17. Again, I'm in the continued learning playlist. I'm going to right-click the navigator, create a new file, SwiftUI view. Let's call it ScrollViewPaging Bootcamp. All right. ScrollViewPaging, because paging is one of the features that we can now do using a scroll view. All right. We are going to start this one pretty simple. All right, let's get this started. We're going to build out a scroll view. We're going to play around with it a little bit. For those of you who are just joining, I did a video earlier in this bootcamp on ScrollView Reader. ScrollView Reader, we wrapped our scroll view, we added a ScrollView Reader. We get the geometry proxy from the reader, and then we use that to animate if we want to animate our scroll view to a certain item. That was great. This is now the new version of doing that, and that's because these modifiers that have been added to the SwiftUI framework allow us to have much more customization over the actual scroll view. So this still works, it'll still compile, but there are better and easier ways to do it now. That's what we're going to go through in the rest of this video. Let's start out with a basic scroll view here. And I'm going to put some content on the screen. It's going to be a vertical scroll view, so I'll use a V stack as well with some spacing of maybe 30 and open the brackets. And then we're going to do a for each item. We'll do 0 to less than maybe 10, for each index in, and let's just put on the screen a rectangle. I'm going to make the rectangle, give it a frame of maybe 300 by 300. So we got some squares here. And I'm going to put an overlay on the rectangle just with some quick text that has the actual index that we are on. And let's make that a foreground color of white so that we can see it. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 6. All right, cool. All right, let's start looking at some of the cool new modifiers that we have. Firstly, this scroll view bounces by default. We can see that it bounces here, right? If you look at this little, let's make the frame of these a little wider. We can see that the scroll view indicator on the right side of the screen bounces, right? Well, there's a new modifier called .ScrollViewBounceBehavior, scroll bounce behavior. And we can set this as automatic, which is by default, it's on automatic. We can set it to always or based on size. Always meaning always allow this bounce to happen in the scroll view. But what if the scroll view doesn't have that many cells in it? What if it's only maybe 1 or 2 cells? So let's do 2 cells here. Well, we can see both cells here. And there's really no point in having this bouncing UI if there's only 2 cells on this screen. So what I can do is actually make this .based on size. And if the size is less than the entire scroll view frame, then it's going to disable that bounce. So if I try to move it right now, I actually can't even scroll on this because it's based on the size and it's saying that this size is already all the way on the screen. There's no sense in scrolling. So based on size, and right now it doesn't scroll. But if I make this maybe 20 cells and I re-render it, now it scrolls and it bounces. So I think most of the time I'm going to be using scroll bounce behavior as based on size going forward. I like how simple this is to use. All right, next you can see as I scroll, it kind of just scrolls and it stops wherever the physics would stop of the scroll view, right? But what if I wanted to stop kind of at each cell? So it stops when 5 is right in the middle, rather than just scrolling to a random point and then stopping. So there's another modifier here. On the scroll view, I will add a .scroll target layout. And this configures the outermost layout of the scroll target. Let's see what happens. Nothing happens by default. Let's call the scroll target behavior. And now we can make the behavior paging or view aligned. Let's start with view aligned. The scroll behavior that aligns scroll targets to view-based geometry. Let's test it out. As the behavior is now view aligned, as I scroll, the end of the scroll. So if I look at this, this is the deceleration rate and the state at the end of the scroll gesture. So if I go to scroll and I stop my scroll somewhere where the view is not aligned to the top of the view here, it will align it automatically. So for example, if I let's put the right in the middle, right? We have this, let's put this right in the middle here. As I let go, it's going to automatically animate to where this is aligned to the top of the frame here. Let's do it again, and it automatically animates. And it does it the opposite way, and does the reverse as well. So I think most scroll view layouts probably want some sort of view aligned to it. We can also do paging. And paging is basically, as you swipe, sort of like a TikTok feed, it's going to stop at the next section. So when you add paging to your scroll views, one thing you generally want is to make sure that each swipe that the user gets, so if I swipe up, it should go from 18 to 19. If I swipe up right now, so for example, if I come up here and I go to 10 and I try to swipe up, it should go to 11. Swipe up and it goes to 12. And that's because these cells are so small. So one thing that we might want to do is change the size of the frame of the cell so that each swipe is basically one page in the scroll view. And the way that we can do that is add inside each cell, we can add a modifier called .ContainerRelativeFrame. And we can look at the vertical or the horizontal axis. Let's do the vertical axis and let's align it to center. Now we have said, make sure this cell, the frame of this cell is relative to the entire frame of the scroll view. So we can't even see the second object here, but if I swipe up, we now get the next one. So it's a very different UI, but this is much more like a TikTok feed that we're getting at now. I'm going to update this so that we actually look like a TikTok feed. I'm going to take off the frame of this object. Let's make it maybe ignore safe area. And let's start scrolling. And so one thing you notice when you start to do these kind of layouts is that there's spacing between each of these cells. So when we're using like this container relative frame, it doesn't understand that it doesn't account for the spacing in between each cell as well. So if I keep scrolling on this pager right now, we can see this line actually starts to move down the screen. And that's because each cell is offset by an extra 30 pixels. So oftentimes when we're doing this sort of TikTok UI, we actually don't want to include spacing outside of the cells. So we could put spacing here down to 0, and then we can start scrolling. And this is closer, but it's still offset a little bit. We can see the numbers moving up a little bit. And just to prove that, I'm going to put the spacing inside the cell rather than outside the cell. So before we add this container relative frame, let's just do padding of .vertical of maybe 10. So we still have padding, but it's within the cell, so it's accounted for inside this relative frame. And I can scroll here, and it looks like we are so close, but now we almost have the reverse problem where this line is moving up too high. And that's just because this container relative frame is not ignoring the safe area. So the entire scroll view obviously is ignoring the safe area, because if we look at the top of the device, it's going past the scroll area. So in this UI, we actually should just put the ignore scroll area on the scroll view itself. And now we have a TikTok UI. And I have the white area just so that you guys can see that's where the padding is between each cell and that it's working very evenly. But if I take out that padding, we now just have full screen paging. This is the TikTok UI, right? This is so powerful. I think people really don't understand just how much this opens us up as SwiftUI developers, because we can literally get the TikTok, Instagram, Reels feed in a couple lines of code. If you ever use like the App Store app, there's paging left and right on that app everywhere. All of those paging UI is now enabled with literally this one line of code and then combining it with some sort of container relative frame. It is awesome. We're going to do one more example before we wrap up this video, and that is just animating the actual offset of these cells, because we don't need to use that ScrollView reader anymore. So before we begin, let's actually change this ScrollView layout. So I'm going to copy and comment this out and paste another version up here, just because I think this is good code to have for your vertical pager. But let's make a horizontal one now. So we're going to make the ScrollView.horizontal. We'll make this an H stack. We'll still do rectangles. Let's give them a width of maybe 300 by 300. Let's give them maybe a corner radius of 10, just to make them look a little bit nicer. And we will add some spacing. So again, I want to put the spacing in the cell, not on the H stack, so that it is accounted for when we use the container relative frame. So let's add the padding here of maybe 10. And sorry, let's make it all directions. All right. By default, we have the paging on, we have the container relative frame to the vertical axis, but that's not really helping us right now. So let's actually make it container relative frame to the horizontal axis. Cool. Now I got a pager just like that. Couple lines of code. This looks awesome. What if I change this to .view aligned? Well, it looks the same here, but if I remove the container relative frame, view aligned, now I can scroll and I get to the next cell perfectly. So this is just a little bit tweak of the code, and we get this nice paging effect that we otherwise could not have in SwiftUI. This is awesome. The last thing I want to show you guys though is actually just animating the offset. So what we're going to do here is, let's put our scroll view in some sort of VStack, and we'll add a quick button at the top here that just says scroll to. Let's give it an action. And up here, we're going to create @state private var scroll position. Let's make it an integer for now, and we'll make it equal to nil to start. So scroll position, I'm making it an integer because the items we're looping on are just indexes. These are integers. But if I had some sort of identifiable struct, I would probably make this that type instead. And all we're going to do is add an ID onto each cell. And the ID for that cell is going to be the index. So the ID type needs to match the scroll position type. And all we need to do is add a .scroll position modifier. And we will bind to some sort of hashable value. In this case, an integer is hashable, so we will just use the $scroll position. Let's anchor it to the center when we scroll. Cool. When I click this button, let's scroll position, and let's actually just make this a random number between 1 and 20. So we'll do 0 ... less than 20, put that into parentheses, and we'll just call .random element and force unwrap it. So every time we click it, it's going to jump to a random number between 0 and 20, and it should work. We can't really tell because it's the same cell every time. Let's add some animation so that the scroll looks a little bit better rather than just jumping around. So we'll add here maybe some animation of, let's just do .smooth. And we'll animate when the scroll position changes. 9, 15, 9, 15, 10. Awesome. That easy. We get animated scrolling behavior in our app. We can very easily make this paging or view aligned. We can set the frame of the cell relative to the parent view of the scroll view. And I think just generally speaking, this is going to unlock so many user experiences that we could not otherwise have in SwiftUI. Paging is like the root of how TikTok works, Instagram Reels work. The App Store app has a lot of paging in it as well. And all of those UI elements are unlocked by just a couple lines of code in SwiftUI. This is so powerful. I wish paging was available in SwiftUI from the get-go, but I'm very thankful that it is now added. Comment below what you guys think. In my mind, this is the most important thing to come out of iOS 17. Super underrated. And this is probably one of the last things that was missing from the SwiftUI framework. All right, and I actually forgot there's one more thing that I want to show you guys before we wrap up here really quickly. It is the .scroll transition. This is awesome. I'm so excited that we got this. So scroll transition is basically a transition as the cells appear on the screen in the scroll view. And this is like a huge deal for SwiftUI because these transitions are so common and they add such a nice, elegant touch to your app. So if you were scrolling and you wanted an animation to occur when the cell comes onto the screen, whether or not it's horizontal or from the bottom, you can use a scroll transition now. And we're going to click enter here. You'll notice that this returns us an empty visual effect and a scroll transition phase. So the empty visual effect you probably are familiar with now. So in the last video in this series, I covered the visual effect bootcamp. We learned how to use and apply visual effects to our views. We talked a little bit about how that gives us the geometry of the object. But what I'm getting at is the content that we returned was an empty visual effect. And now that we're back in our scroll view, the scroll transition is also giving us an empty visual effect. So this kind of UI pattern is starting to streamline across our SwiftUI code. Let's click enter here. We're going to have the empty visual effect we'll call content, and then the scroll transition phase we'll call phase. This phase is basically just going to tell us whether or not the cell is on the screen or not. So we'll call that phase and we'll just put the content on the screen. And I'm just going to continue with the same example that we have here. So you can see the second cell on the right here, and as you scroll, you can see the second cell at all times. But what if I wanted this cell to maybe animate as it came onto the screen? So for example, I could add opacity, and I can say, if this cell is not on the screen, make it opacity 0. So we'll say if phase.isIdentity, meaning fully on the screen and rendered. So if it is on the screen, we'll give it a opacity of 1. Otherwise, let's give it a 0. We can see here that this next cell is already, the opacity of this is already close to 0. And as I scroll and it comes onto the screen, it's going to get closer to 1. And the reverse is also going to be true for the other piece of content. As it moves off the screen, it's going to go back down to 0. So we can see here coming back off, coming back on. I don't think this animation looks so good with horizontal scrolling. It's better for vertical. I also think probably smaller cells would look a little better for this. So for example, if I had a bunch of small cells and we could animate them onto the screen, that looks much more seamless. But just to keep playing around with this, let's keep the big cells here. The scroll transition also has a configuration. And the configuration by default that we were just playing with is interactive, meaning as you scroll, change that opacity. So as I'm scrolling actively, every single pixel, it is changing the opacity. I could instead do .identity, which basically means don't animate it at all, just keep the identity. I think the reason we have this is mainly to like turn off transitions programmatically if we wanted to. And then we also have .animated. And animated is basically, instead of just as the user scrolls, just at one point, flick it on, flick it off. So it's going to go from 0 to 1 as I scroll, but not progressively like every single pixel that we saw before. And again, this empty visual effect has other modifiers as well. It's not just opacity. We can do a lot of things to this view. So for example, we could do blur, brightness, color effect. I like to do offsets. So here we could do something like, let's play around with the Y, and we'll say maybe if phase dot is identity, let's give it 0, and then we'll say otherwise maybe negative 100. Let's go back to the dot interactive, and now we can start to see some cooler effects. It looks like it's getting cut off at the top, so maybe I want to add some padding on my H stack here. Let's do just vertical of 100. And so now we have this cool effect. I don't know, you guys can play around with this, but the scroll transition in combination with all of these new ScrollView modifiers is literally just like adding steroids to the ScrollView. There's so many possibilities with these modifiers. You guys should be as hyped as I am because this is game changer for SwiftUI. And one thing that I actually recently found out is these configurations also have, I guess there's a timing curve on here, but I'm looking for the .threshold. So we can set a threshold. So basically, when do we want this animation to occur when it's coming on and off the screen? So this threshold here, let's say maybe when it is visible by 10%. So this is already 10% onto the screen, so we can fully see it, right? But as I go down to less than 10%, it starts to animate. We can see that there. It's right at the edge of the screen, right? But if I change this to maybe 90%, we can see that's going to animate for a while as it comes onto the screen. So the threshold is going to play a big factor in really making these pixel perfect UIs here. All right, that's it for me. There may actually be some ScrollView modifiers that I missed. If I missed anything or you guys know any tips and tricks, leave a comment below. There are a lot of viewers that are reading the comments and learning from the comments. So if you want to help anybody out and you have some tips, leave them below. Thank you guys for watching. As always, my name is Nick. This is Swiftful Thinking, and I'll see you in the next video.